So everything's been applied against everything. I only have 2 objects, so I don't really care at this point. But when I have a 3rd object, it's going to matter. But here are your different collision options. Send collision, receive collision, send physics, and receive physics. So the best way for me to explain this is always it's sending and receiving requests. So in this case, I want to handle, and this all depends on how you want to handle the collision. And right now, I'm just going to design this so the collision is handled on the ball itself. The ball will collide with the pad. The pad's just going to basically respond to that collision. So to tell it to respond to the collision, I'm going to just say receive collision. Basically receiving a collision request. Something collides against it, I'm telling it, yes, tell things that you can respond to collision.
It's basically kind of assigning a job to that object. So that paddle its job is just receiving the collision from the ball. That's all it's doing.
Right, exactly. Now I could just enable them all, and in some cases you don't really care. You just tell it to respond to everything. But in some cases you want it to respond with collision. In some cases you don't want it to respond with physics, or you don't want the paddle itself. We don't want the ball to hit the paddle and push it off screen or something like that. So we don't want to tell it to respond to physics. So these are all come down to how you want your game. Maybe you do. In that case, you can.
But what's send and receive physics, and then a collision is like if it just collides with each other, what's the physics? Is that just bounce collision?
Yeah. So in this case, physics is, collision won't actually do anything by default. I can enable a callback and I can handle it in script. Physics allows you to take advantage of the built-in physics system. Now, you don't have to use the built-in physics system. Some games you don't want physics, you just want, like say when a projectile hits a player, you don't want it to necessarily bounce off the player, right? You just want to know when it hits the player. In that case, you don't want any physics interactions going on, right? Bouncing off may be undesired. You just enable collision, you tell none of them to use physics, and you just handle it via the callback and say, destroy projectile and take damage and things like that.
Can you write custom physics traits for the engine to use on?
Yes, so you can handle some of that in script. This brings in the whole subject of what should you do script, what should you do C++. You can control the physics, kind of utilizing the physics system, but not using the built-in physics if you don't want to. So if you're not getting the correct physics response, you can also trigger a script response and do things like. So one thing I'm going to do later is to make it more interesting. When the ball bounces off the paddle, actually send an impulse on it. So that way it doesn't just bounce off and it shoots off of it, right? Make it a little more interesting, if that's what you want. That's taking advantage of the physics system, but also the ability to call it. Now, if you get TGP Pro, you get all the source code. There are some options for custom physics responses, even to be exposed in the editor, and obviously the source code you write if you want. For the vast majority of games, the physics built in is appropriate for it, and you can control a lot of it just in the script, like zeroing out the objects, just setting it to rest, setting it with an extra velocity, clamping its velocity, things like that. Those are perfectly appropriate for script. So on the actual ball, I'm going to tell it to send collision and send physics requests. And see if I got that right. That was an undesired result. So, yeah, I forgot one step. So that was a clamp response. So it clamps on collision. Has a built-in bounce option. There is some rigid physics options. So if you wanted to act like full 2D rigid physics, you can tie into that, which includes like defining some mass and inertia values. There are some limitations with the built-in physics system. That's why with the next version of Torque 2D, we're just going with Box 2D, which is a much better physics engine than we've built. Is anybody checked out Box 2D demos? One of the cool ones is there's some people
About the Jensen machine?
Oh.
See that one? That's pretty slick and fast.
I don't think I've seen it.
With the spider lightning.
Oh, yeah, no.
Mechanical.
Yeah. that it's doing constraints. So that has full constraints built in, things like that. The physics here works for quite a few different games, but if you're looking for constraints, things like that, the next version of Torque 2D will have a lot more physics options.
Anything soft body coming soon?
Soft body,
Like World of Goo or?
So right now we're looking at just supporting what Box 2D has. I don't think Box 2D has any soft body.
Okay.
Someone may be more familiar with Box 2D than me. It has constraints and basic, rigid body physics responses. I don't think we're supporting soft body. That's something you could add to the engine if you get the source code. It's pretty easy to add in your own physics responses. There's actually specific custom calls for that, and you can plug it in. And some of that stuff gets to kind of game-specific functionality, where in some cases it makes sense for us to add to the engine, but how many people are actually going to use it in their games? If it's like 2% of our user base, that's a lot of time for us to spend on a custom solution. Box 2D should enhance our physics quite a bit without us spending unneeded time on it. The vast majority of games, like constraints and basic rigid body for 2D games, gives you quite a bit of options. And you can't do constraints in TGB right now, but you can do balanced collisions and things like that. And you can do basic rigid body. There are some limitations to the physics system.
So you're talking rigid body or soft body, you're talking like the shape of the object itself not being able to press, or are you talking more? I'm a little...
So rigid body is kind of like so it just like a more appropriate rigid body response, like
There's no dampening effect on the physics.
Okay.
So once two things hit each other, they collide with standard physics dealing with momentum.
Okay.
When you start putting dampening effects in, things like that, it gets all
That's-
soft bodies.
Okay, gotcha.
so that includes dampening, and like angular rotations and impulses at angles and stuff right now. So the bounce right now, you notice it doesn't spin the circle. If I enabled rigid body, it could spin it with some angular rotation. So for this case, I'm just keeping it simple. TGB, you can do some rigid body. Box 2D has a very nice rigid body support constraints. To check out Box 2D, there's some Flash integrations of Box 2D that are pretty nice. And those you can check out, like those spider features that are all built on the other constraint systems and stuff like that. A lot of games don't need much physics at all, like basic stuff, platformers, kind of shoot 'em ups. You just want basic physics and lots of particles, right? And particles we do have. So I had it on clamp. I set it as bounce.
The other one, because the collision isn't happening on the pad doesn't need to have balance on it.
Right. So right now I'm handling it so if I were to take this to the next level, I would probably want to handle some collision response on the paddle, because it gets into some situations where when the pad's moving, it's just responding to it like it's hitting against it. So I can like move it, but for this demonstration, it's just, getting it up and running is nice. You can then control the physics on the paddle itself, and tell it how to control it. So right now,
You feel like controlling the speed of how it moves, like it all bounces around you.
yeah,
Because it bounces really fast.
as you see right there, I can get some push. And some of those can be done actually without even